The snow outside the Aspen Mountain Lodge had been falling for 11 hours without pause. Inside the main conference room of the Whitmore estate, a private property Victoria Hale had leased for the week, at a figure that would have covered 6 months of Lucas Reed's salary. The silence was the kind that preceded catastrophe, not peace. The kind of silence that comes when everyone in a room realizes, simultaneously, that something has gone catastrophically wrong and nobody is willing to be the first to say it aloud. $42 million in interior design. Hand-carved mahogany tables imported from a craftsman in Bavaria. Crystal glasses filled with still water from a Norwegian glacier. The kind of room where money didn't just sit, it announced itself. Every surface, a declaration. Victoria had chosen this estate precisely because it communicated what she wanted communicated before she even opened her mouth. I am not negotiating from a position of weakness. I am never in a position of weakness. Except right now, she was. The consortium sat across the table in 3 distinct clusters, as though even their seating arrangement had been choreographed to unsettle her. On the left, the German representatives Heinrich Brandt and his 2 associates, men who wore their authority the way old money wears good wool. In the center, the Russian contingent led by Dmitry Volkov, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, and who had the disconcerting habit of folding his hands on the table as though he were in no particular hurry, which, Victoria had learned through 2 days of preliminary discussions, was his way of signaling that he had all the time in the world, and she did not. On the right, the French delegation, anchored by Isabelle Fontaine, a former Minister of Economic Affairs turned private equity architect, who wore a single strand of pearls and spoke in sentences so precisely constructed they felt less like communication and more like legal documents. The lead translator, a man named Patrick Ellison, who had worked 3 continents for Victoria's firm and had been flown in specifically for this negotiation, had sent a text at 6:47 that morning. Stranded in Denver. I-70 is closed. Not possible. I'm so sorry. Victoria had read that text 4 times. She had then set her phone face down on the vanity of her private suite and stood very still for 30 seconds, long enough to acknowledge the problem, short enough that it didn't become panic, and then gone about getting dressed. She had come into this room with 2 backup interpreters. The first, a junior associate named Garrett who handled French and had passable German, had lasted approximately 40 minutes before Volkov opened in rapid Siberian-inflected Russian that bore almost no resemblance to the textbook language Garrett had studied at Georgetown. The second had called in sick the previous evening. The estate's property manager had reached out to 3 local services, all unavailable. The storm had sealed Aspen into something resembling a snow globe, beautiful from outside, suffocating from within. Now it was 14 inches the afternoon, and Heinrich Brandt was speaking. He had been speaking for 4 minutes in German, and the pace of his words had shifted. Victoria knew enough to recognize that from formal to something more pointed. His associate was taking notes. Volkov was smiling his particular smile. Fontaine had produced a secondary document from her leather portfolio and was sliding it across to Brandt with 2 fingers, as though the gesture itself were a formality they'd rehearsed. Victoria understood what was happening. She had been in enough rooms like this to read the weather without a forecast. They were adjusting the terms. Right now, without her being able to follow a single word with precision, they were adjusting the terms of a $1.3 billion acquisition, and every second she sat here nodding with careful neutrality was a second in which she was losing ground she could not afford to lose. She felt it, that tightening in her chest, that particular heat behind her eyes that she had spent 16 years training herself to never show. Victoria Hale did not panic. Victoria Hale managed. She was still telling herself this when the door at the back of the room opened. Lucas Reed had been standing in the corridor outside for the past 90 minutes. He did this, she had noticed it early in the weeks she'd employed him. Other drivers waited in the car, in lobbies, in designated rooms. Lucas waited near the door. not intrusively, just near. She had found it slightly irritating the first few times. Today she had registered his presence the way you register weather. Factual, not particularly consequential. He was wearing the same dark jacket he always wore. He hadn't changed for the meeting because he was not supposed to be in the meeting. He was the driver. He stepped through the door. Victoria looked at him. A fraction of a second, the kind of look that asks a question without asking it. Lucas didn't look back at her. He walked to the center of the room, stopped, and addressed Heinrich Brandt directly. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. He spoke in German. The words were precise. Victoria caught nothing, her German extended as far as Danke and the names of a handful of wines, but she heard the shape of it. Formal registers. The particular rhythm of a native speaker navigating technical vocabulary. Brandt blinked. His associate stopped writing. Then Lucas turned, slightly, toward Volkov. He spoke in Russian. Unhurried. Something shifted in Volkov's expression. The practiced pleasantness flickered, just slightly, and underneath it something more alert surfaced. Then French, and when Isabelle Fontaine responded in a crisp torrent, Lucas replied without pause, and for the first time in 4 hours, Fontaine's expression lost its careful composure and became something that looked, if Victoria was reading it correctly, like genuine surprise. The room was silent in the way that rooms are silent when everyone is holding their breath. Victoria sat at the head of that table and felt the strangest sensation. She was watching a man she had categorized, filed, shelved, dismissed, reveal himself to be something else entirely, something she had not accounted for, something that had been standing one room away this entire time. She had spent 11 years never being the person who failed to account for something. The cold certainty of that realization settled over her like the snow still falling outside. Rewind 48 hours. Victoria Catherine Hale was 36 years old and had been on the cover of Forbes twice. She did not find this particularly meaningful. Forbes was a publication that treated success like a beauty pageant, and Victoria had never been interested in pageants, but she understood that it communicated something useful to the people she needed to communicate things to. So she allowed the covers. She didn't hang them anywhere. Hale Global operated in 12 countries. Its core business was strategic acquisition, identifying undervalued assets. Some people called it corporate rating. Victoria called it precision. The distinction mattered to her more than she would ever admit in an interview. She had built the company from a $4 million seed from an inheritance her father had left, and the fact that she had started with money at all was the one thing she'd never been able to fully insulate herself from in the press. Born rich, stayed rich was the subtext beneath every third article. What the articles never accounted for was the decade of 18-hour days, the 3 failed acquisitions she'd absorbed without blinking, the moment at 31 when she'd been 48 hours from a forced liquidation and had spent an entire night restructuring her position through instruments her own CFO hadn't understood. She'd survived it. She'd come out on the other side having learned something her MBA had never taught her, that the only thing standing between you and collapse at any given moment was the quality of your preparation. She believed in preparation the way some people believe in God. It was axiomatic. It was moral. If you arrived unprepared, you deserved what happened to you. This was, she was aware, not a philosophy that allowed for much sympathy. Victoria did not think sympathy was her job. She thought results were her job. The Aspen deal, the acquisition of Eurovantage Holdings through its 3-nation consortium structure, was the culmination of 8 months of groundwork, $2 billion in financing arrangements, and more strategic patience than she typically afforded any single project. Eurovantage controlled a logistics and infrastructure portfolio that, restructured under Hale Global's model, would generate yield that justified every dollar of the risk. She had run the numbers herself. She ran all the numbers herself, a habit her analysts found somewhere between charming and unnerving. She had chosen Aspen because she liked to control the environment. A private estate meant controlled access. no press, no leaks, and the psychological pressure of altitude and isolation working in her favor. She had been in negotiations where location tipped the balance. She believed in every variable. She had not adequately prepared for the variable of a blizzard. The morning of the convoy into the estate, she'd been in the back seat of the town car reviewing documents on her tablet when she'd heard something that stopped her mid-paragraph. Lucas, in the front seat, had been listening to something through a single earbud. She'd noticed this before. Audio files, voices, never music, and had said a word aloud, softly, the way you repeat a word you're trying to fix in memory. The word had been French. The pronunciation had been very good. She had not thought about it again. Or, and this was the thing she would reckon with later, she had noticed it and filed it as irrelevant. Because the category she'd assigned him, driver, functional, replaceable, came with an implicit ceiling, and her mind had simply enforced that ceiling without her consciously instructing it to do so. The night before the consortium arrived, she'd been walking to the kitchen of the estate and found Lucas at the large oak table in the staff common area, one lamp on, reading. Not a novel. She'd glanced at the cover. A dense academic text, German title, heavy spine. He'd looked up when she entered, closed the book without hurrying. "Still working?" she'd asked. She wasn't sure why she'd said anything at all. "Reading," he'd said. In German. She had poured herself a glass of water. "You speak German?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be deliberate. Some. She had left the kitchen. Some. She had believed him, which said something about how thoroughly she had already decided who he was. Lucas Reed had driven the car service route for 14 months. Before that, he had held a position that, explained accurately, would have generated a certain kind of reaction. The recalibration of eye contact, the subtle shift in posture that people undergo when they realize they've been speaking to someone at a level below what they should have been. He was familiar with that recalibration. He had, in the 14 months since leaving his previous life, encountered it occasionally, usually when he'd said something at precisely the wrong moment, and somebody caught a glimpse of the frame beneath the surface. He had found he didn't mind the current arrangement. Most days. The work was straightforward. The hours were defined. He was home by 7:30 on nights he planned for it, which meant home for Emma's dinner, home for the reading that had become their ritual 30 minutes every night, whatever book she was into. Right now, it was a story about a girl who could talk to birds. Emma had opinions about it, specific and articulate opinions, and she delivered them seriously with the gravity of someone who had considered the matter at length. Emma was 8. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, and a laugh that sounded like it belonged to someone who had never known anything sad. It was, in Lucas's private assessment, the single most important thing he had ever produced in his life. It was, without competition, the reason for every decision he had made in the past 3 years. His wife, Claire, had died 22 months ago. He did not think about this constantly. This was not because he had processed it cleanly or moved past it in any therapeutic sense. He had been honest with his therapist about that, and his therapist had been honest with him in return, and they had agreed that what he was doing was managing, which was not the same as healed, but was the appropriate mode for where he currently was. He thought about Claire at particular moments, when Emma made that laugh, when he passed a bookstore that had been their kind of bookstore, when someone used an expression Claire had used. He kept these moments. He did not chase them away. The medical expenses had not surprised him. He had been managing Claire's illness long enough to know the approximate shape of the cost, and he had made decisions accordingly, sold the apartment, liquidated his investment accounts, drawn down what savings existed. When she died, the remaining debt was still substantial, not ruinous, but the kind of number that required a certain kind of income to address without sacrificing Emma's stability. He had done the math. The car service paid well for the hours. The flexibility allowed him to structure his schedule around Emma's school. It was, he had concluded, the right equation for the current period. He had explained none of this to anyone at work. He kept a book in the car's front console because he had always read. The languages weren't something he'd maintained deliberately so much as something that had never fully left neurons. Once trained deeply, don't easily surrender what they know. He'd spent 7 years working across European markets for a firm that no longer existed in its original form. The languages had been the price of admission, and he'd paid it with genuine interest. German because it was necessary, and then because it was beautiful in a strange, angular way. Russian because it was the hardest, and he'd been too stubborn not to master it. French because it was everywhere, and then because he loved it. Mandarin, which he'd dropped in the past year for lack of use. He had not planned to use any of them in that conference room. He had been in the corridor listening because that was where he waited, and because the voices inside had changed timbre in a way that he recognized. When negotiation shifts from formal to predatory, there is a particular sonic quality to it, a loosening, a quickening on the aggressor's side. He had heard it through the door and understood what it meant. He had stood there for several minutes, reasoning with himself. This is not your room. You are not here in that capacity. She hasn't asked. And then he had thought about Emma, and about the fact that the woman on the other side of that door was the employer whose goodwill currently underwrote his daughter's life, and he had thought about what he would be if he stood in a corridor and let something collapse that he could stop. He had opened the door. 4 days earlier, on the drive from the Aspen airstrip to the Whitmore estate, Victoria had been on a call for the first 40 minutes, which was typical. Lucas drove. The road wound into the mountains, and the light changed the way it does in high country, flatter and more absolute, and he'd listened to the call with the passive attention of someone whose years of boardroom practice had made eavesdropping feel like background music. She'd ended the call, and the car had gone quiet. "You have a daughter," she'd said eventually. It wasn't a question. She'd seen the photo on the dashboard console, the only personal item he kept in the car. "Emma," he said. 8. "And you're doing this alone." A pause. The particular kind Victoria deployed before she said something she'd already composed. That must make ambition difficult. He hadn't answered immediately. The road curved around a ridge, and the valley opened below them, vast and white. "I have ambitions," he said. "They're just organized differently than they used to be." Around her, mostly. He could feel her looking at him through the rearview mirror. She had a way of observing that was thorough and slightly uncomfortable, like a complete assessment being filed in real time. "I'm not sure I understand that," she said. "Voluntarily making yourself smaller. I don't experience it as smaller." "Then how do you experience it?" "Correctly prioritized." Another pause. And then, "A man who walks away from his career for a child. I've always found that difficult to admire. The sacrifice is real, I'm sure, but it leaves the child with a father who's not fully himself. A diminished version. How does that help anyone?" The words were not explosive. She said them with a kind of clean neutrality, as though she were stating a business position and inviting counter-argument. That was, in a way, more cutting than if she'd been deliberately cruel. It suggested she hadn't considered that he might have feelings about it, or had considered it and decided it was less relevant than the logic of her point. Lucas let a moment pass. "You'd have to know Emma to understand," he said. "Why, there's nothing diminished about it." Victoria had said nothing further. She looked at something on her tablet. The car continued into the mountain. The following morning, he'd brought coffee from a local place he'd found a particular Ethiopian roast she'd mentioned, offhand, on a previous trip as being the only kind worth drinking at altitude. He'd located it, driven 15 minutes to get it, placed it in the cup holder before she came down. She'd gotten in, picked up the cup, taken a sip, said nothing. He hadn't expected anything. He'd done it because the logistics made sense to him and because it was the job. 20 minutes into the drive, reviewing her materials, she'd said, without looking up, "Someone who's been to the same places you have doesn't settle for this kind of work unless something broke." It was not a question. It was a trap laid with casual precision. "Things break," he said. You rebuild around what's left. Or, she said, you acknowledge you've given up. He had let that one go entirely. That evening in the estate's library, she'd been walking past and the door was open and he was at the table with the German text she'd stopped in the doorway. That's academic contract law, she said. European framework. He had looked up. Cross-border acquisition structures, he confirmed. He had considered his answer carefully. I'm interested in how the Eurovantage consortium is structured. The three-nation holding arrangement creates some unusual liability questions. Something passed across her face, a fractional narrowing, interest or suspicion. It was difficult to say. You've read the deal brief. I haven't. I know Eurovantage from its public filings. The German entity controls the infrastructure assets, but the French holding company holds the IP rights under a separate licensing arrangement. If the acquisition closes under the current structure, Hale Global inherits a licensing liability that doesn't show up on the balance sheet as a liability, it shows up as an asset, which makes the valuation look better than it is. The silence that followed had a texture. I know, she said finally. It's been addressed. He had nodded and returned to his book. She had stood in the doorway 2 seconds longer than necessary, then continued down the hall. She would later acknowledge, only to herself, that she had not actually verified whether it had been fully addressed. She had said, I know, because she was Victoria Hale and she was always meant to know, and she had not wanted to be in the position of receiving material intelligence from her driver. This was, she would recognize in retrospect, the exact shape of the mistake that defined her. Back to 2:14 p.m. Lucas had positioned himself at a neutral point in the room, not at the table, not at its head, not aligned with either side. He stood the way someone stands when they have decided something and are proceeding without drama. He had opened in German because Brandt was the structural architect of the consortium, and because the German argument, if it was going where he suspected, needed to be cut at the root before it branched. He spoke for approximately 90 seconds. Clean, formal German, the kind shaped by years of Hamburg and Frankfurt conference rooms, not textbooks. He had identified the specific clause being redrafted he'd heard enough through the door to triangulate it and had named it precisely, then outlined why the proposed revision created an asymmetric exposure that the consortium's own legal framework would not protect them from. This was not an argument from weakness. It was a technical observation stated as fact. Brandt's associate had stopped writing. Brandt himself had looked at Lucas with the expression of someone recalibrating a map. Lucas had then turned to Volkov and spoken in Russian. What he said was shorter, less technical. Volkov was not the legal mind in the room, he was the enforcer of the Russian capital position, which meant his levers were relational, not contractual. Lucas addressed the relational lever. He named, in plain Russian, 2 previous transactions in which Volkov's group had structured similar consortium plays and the specific outcomes accurate to the decimal of each. He did not editorialize. He simply made it clear that the history of the room was known. Volkov's smile had not vanished, but it had changed quality. Then French for Fontaine. And this conversation was different longer, more intricate, moving between the technical and the philosophical in the way that French commercial discourse often does, never quite separating the elegant from the practical. Fontaine had replied. A sharp, precise counter. She was genuinely brilliant. Lucas had concluded from the public record, and she was not going to fold to a recitation of known facts. She had pushed on the IP licensing point, arguing that the structuring had been reviewed by 3 independent firms. Lucas had agreed that it had. He had then cited, from memory, a 2019 ruling from the European Court of Justice that had subsequently reframed how cross-border IP licensing was treated in 3-country holding arrangements. Fontaine had known the ruling. What she had not known, he could see it in the pause, was how precisely it applied here. The room had gone very quiet. Victoria, at the head of the table, had said nothing. She was watching with an expression that Lucas could not read from where he stood, but that felt to him like the expression of someone recalculating something large and fundamental. He had then addressed the full room in English, clear, unaccented, international English, the register of someone who has negotiated across enough languages that English becomes the neutral landing space. He had laid out, simply, where the deal needed to land in order to be viable for all parties. Not what was good for Hale Global. What was viable. Structural sustainability was a more durable argument than positional advantage, and he knew it. He stopped speaking. The room had remained quiet for 4 or 5 seconds. Then Fontaine said, in French, something that Lucas did not translate aloud. He simply nodded. Volkov leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling in the particular way of a man who is deciding whether to be amused or irritated, and has chosen amusement. Brandt said, in German. "Who are you?" Lucas replied in German. The driver, and something happened in that moment in the timbre of the answer, in the precision of it that functioned better than any elaborate introduction could have. Victoria made a decision in approximately 5 seconds. She stood up from the head of the table and said, clearly, "This is Lucas Reed. He'll be joining the discussion as a strategic advisor for the remainder of the session." No one argued. No one asked for credentials. The room had already answered the question of credentials. She took the secondary seat to his right. What followed was the strangest 3 hours of Victoria Hale's professional life, which was, in itself, a remarkable statement. She was the CEO. She was the architect of this deal. She controlled the financial structure, the strategic rationale, the entire 9 months of groundwork. And she sat in a room and watched a man who had been driving her car for 6 weeks dismantle and reassemble the structure of a $1.3 billion negotiation with the quiet efficiency of someone who had never stopped being exactly what he used to be. She was not passive. This mattered. It would matter to her, later, that she had not been passive. She knew the deal. She knew the numbers. When Lucas needed her to confirm financial positions or to make executive decisions on acceptable terms, she made them. They developed, in real time, a working rhythm that was almost startling in its functionality. He framing the language, she providing the authority, he translating the subtext of what each party actually wanted, she translating that into concrete structural concessions she could afford to make. At 5:08 p.m., Heinrich Brandt placed his pen on the table and said, in German, a sentence Lucas translated precisely, "I think we can proceed on these terms." Fontaine had already signed the secondary document, revised according to the afternoon's discussion. Volkov looked at his associate, received a small nod, and added his signature to the primary framework agreement. It was not a closed deal. It was a framework, a step, an agreement to advance on specific terms to final documentation. But it was the step, the one that had been sliding away from Victoria all afternoon, the one she had felt slipping through structure she couldn't grab hold of because the room was speaking in languages she couldn't follow, and now it was signed. Sitting in the center of that mahogany table, real, Brandt stood and extended his hand to Lucas. Not to Victoria. To Lucas. Victoria watched him shake it. The consortium had retired to their respective suites within the estate by 6 p.m. The storm had not abated. They would stay the night. The document would be reviewed by lawyers in the morning. The final framework call would happen remotely the following week. All of this was arranged by the estate manager and by Victoria's assistant in a series of logistical communications that occupied no one's emotional attention. Victoria found Lucas in the corridor outside the conference room. He was standing at the large window at the corridor's end, looking out at the mountain. The snow came sideways now, thick and purposeless, the kind of storm that erases the difference between sky and ground. She stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for approximately 30 seconds. "You're going to want to explain," she said, finally. "I'm going to want to get home," he said. "Emma has a cardiology follow-up tomorrow morning, and I need to be there." She absorbed this. "The appointment can't be rescheduled?" "I don't reschedule Emma's appointments." Another silence. She had the particular feeling of someone whose footing has shifted and who is still calibrating where solid ground is. "You told me last night about the IP licensing liability," she said. "I did. I told you I knew. You did. I didn't fully know." He turned from the window and looked at her. He had, she now noticed, very direct eyes, not aggressive, not soft. Level. The eyes of someone who had decided not to perform anything. "No," he said. "You didn't." She didn't flinch from it. She had not built a career by flinching. "Why did you read the public filings on Eurovantage?" A pause. "I was curious about the deal. It was mentioned in documents you were reviewing in the car, and you were curious. I'm frequently curious about corporate acquisition structures, among other things." She had learned, over the years, the exact cost of asking the next question versus letting a silence do the work. She chose the question. "Who were you before you drove cars?" Lucas looked back at the window. The snow continued its work. "Meridian Cross Capital," he said. "Chief Strategy Officer. Before that, senior partner at a firm called Brunswick Holt, you won't know the name. They folded in 2019. I spent about 11 years doing what you do. Different firm, different scale. The languages came with the territory, European markets, a lot of travel." She was quiet for a moment. "Why did you leave Meridian Cross?" "Claire was diagnosed 18 months before she died. The treatment was in Chicago, we were based in New York. I restructured my life around her care, and then her death, and then Emma." A pause. "I'm not going to be sentimental about it. It was the only equation that made sense. And the driving. The driving pays well and fits Emma's school schedule. It was always a temporary arrangement." "How temporary?" He looked at her. "I hadn't set a specific endpoint." Victoria was quiet again. When she spoke, her voice had lost its customary crispness, not quite soft, but unguarded in a way that was unusual. "I said something to you. On the drive here." She paused. "About diminishment. It was wrong. Not just unkind, the logic was wrong. I was using a framework that didn't apply, and I applied it anyway, because categorizing people quickly is a habit I've never questioned." Lucas nodded slowly. "I noticed. I imagine you did. For what it's worth," he said, "I've heard worse. And the categorization wasn't entirely without basis. I am, technically, your driver. You are technically not remotely just my driver." For the first time, something that was close to a smile crossed his face. "Brief?" "Genuine." "No," he agreed. It came the next morning, at breakfast. Victoria set a single document on the table in front of him. 2 pages, cleanly typeset. The kind of document that had been drafted the previous evening by someone working very quickly and very carefully. "Chief Strategic Advisor," she said. "To be formalized as Chief Strategy Officer within 90 days, pending board approval, which will happen. Salary is on page 1. Equity structure is on page 2. It's not symbolic, it's material. Before you say anything, the position has been on my org chart as a vacancy for 7 months. I've interviewed 11 people and found none of them sufficient." Lucas looked at the document. He did not pick it up. "Emma's cardiology appointment," he said. "Your schedule is your schedule. The position has no geographic requirement and no fixed hours requirement. I care about outcomes, not presence." He was quiet. "There's something else," she said. She placed a second piece of paper on the table. This one was not a contract, it was a letter, on Hale Global letterhead, addressed to Dr. Nathan Chu at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Chu was, Lucas knew, one of the 3 best pediatric cardiac surgeons practicing in the country. He knew this because he had researched it in detail 18 months ago, and had come very close to affording it, and had not quite gotten there. "The surgery costs are covered," Victoria said. "Whatever is needed." The letter establishes the relationship. His office is expecting a call. The timing is Emma's timing, not mine. A pause. I want to be clear. This is not contingent on the position. The support for Emma exists regardless of what you decide about the job. Lucas looked at the letter. He was someone who had spent a very long time managing the precise architecture of his own emotional containment. It was something he'd built in the months after Claire died. Out of necessity, Emma needed a father who was functional, not a father who was drowning. And so he had learned to be functional. He had become quite good at it. The letter on the table made the architecture flex in a way he had not anticipated. He picked it up. The handwriting in the corner and annotation, clearly added personally, not printed, read, "Dr. Chu comes highly recommended. Emma deserves the best possible outcome. V.H." He set it down carefully. Victoria was watching him with an expression that was, for possibly the first time since he'd known her, entirely without agenda. No strategy behind it. Just looking. "Why Emma specifically?" he asked. His voice was even, but only barely. "Because she's the reason," Victoria said. "For all of it." And I said something that called her a limitation. "She isn't. She's the reason you're the person who can walk into that room and do what you did." A pause. "I'm not good at this, admitting things like this. But I'm trying to be accurate." The snow had slowed overnight. Through the window of the estate's breakfast room, the mountain was visible now, white and absolute and very still. Lucas sat with the two documents for a long moment. "I'll read the contract," he said. "That's all I'm asking. And I'm calling Chu's office today. His assistant is already expecting you." He looked at her. "You were very sure I'd say yes." "No," she said. "I was prepared. Those are different things." And something in that, the honesty of it, the way she said it without apology, but also without armor, made him think that Victoria Hale might be someone quite different from the version of herself she worked so hard to present to the world. "The IP licensing issue," he said. "The one I mentioned. It's solvable, but it needs to be addressed before the final documentation goes through. I know. I had my legal team on it by 7 a.m. this morning. And the third clause in Volkov's framework letter, the one about dispute resolution jurisdiction, needs to be looked at. He'll try to move it to Russian jurisdiction in the final draft. It'll be presented as a minor revision." Victoria looked at him. "I'll have someone watch for it. Have me watch for it," he said. "I'll see it faster." She was quiet for a moment. Then, with something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory, "Is that a conditional acceptance?" "That's a preliminary yes. I'll take it." Outside, the snow had stopped entirely. The mountain stood against a sky that was clearing from the west, the clouds breaking apart in long horizontal strips. Below the estate, an aspen grove emerged from the white, the gray-white trunks of the trees in perfect vertical lines, the kind of still that comes after a storm has exhausted itself. Lucas looked at the letter again. Emma's name was on it. Just her first name, in the printed address. But seeing it here, in this room, in a document that meant the surgery could happen, that the particular fear he carried in the back of every conversation and behind every day was, if not gone, then decisively addressed, that was the thing that finally moved through the architecture he'd built. Not collapse, not flood. Just a single, quiet movement, like a door opening into a room he hadn't been in for a long time. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. The consortium's cars arrived at 10 that morning. The road had been cleared overnight by the estate's grounds crew, the kind of service that costs what it costs and does what it does. Lucas stood in the estate's entrance hall as the delegations prepared to depart. He had changed his jacket. This one was different, slightly better, in the way that small adjustments signal a shift that has already been decided internally. Fontaine stopped in front of him. She looked at him for a moment with the particular regard of someone who is reconsidering a data point. "Où avez-vous appris le français comme ça?" she asked. "Where did you learn French like that?" "Paris," he said. "Geneva." "About 7 years." She nodded, a small, precise nod. "The ECJ ruling you cited, the application you made. I'm going to have to take that back to our legal team. You should. It'll hold. Another small nod. And then, in the way of French formality, she extended her hand. He shook it. Volkov passed without particular ceremony, which was its own form of acknowledgement from a man whose default mode was theatrical. He made eye contact with Lucas for approximately 2 seconds, the kind of eye contact that catalogs and files and moves on, and then walked out into the mountain air. Brandt stopped. He was an older man, late 60s, with the weathered authority of someone who had built a great deal and intended to continue building. He looked at Lucas with an expression that was, surprisingly, warm. "Sie hätten früher reden sollen," he said. "You should have spoken sooner." "I spoke at the right time," Lucas replied, in German. Brandt laughed short and genuine. "Perhaps." He glanced at Victoria, who stood nearby. "You have an unusual team." "I'm building a better one," Victoria said. Brandt nodded once and walked out. The estate fell quiet in the way of places that have held a lot of people and then released them. Victoria and Lucas stood in the entrance hall. The mountain was full in the windows, now blue sky, white mountain, the particular clarity of high altitude after a storm. "The road's clear," Lucas said. "We could leave in an hour." "Yes." A pause. "I'll drive." He looked at her. "Or not," she said. I don't know why I said that. "I'll drive," he said. "It's my job. Technically, he agreed. There was something in the word now that neither of them had to explain. The way the same word can mean the same thing and something completely different, depending on the ground beneath it. The drive from the Whitmore estate took 40 minutes in clear weather. Lucas drove. Victoria sat in the back seat, which was the arrangement. But she had moved her tablet to the seat beside her and was not looking at it. 20 minutes into the drive, the valley came into view below the town. The roads, the ordinary infrastructure of life, carrying on without particular awareness that 48 hours ago, a billion-dollar negotiation had teetered on the edge of collapse and been pulled back by a man no one had thought to account for. "The position," Victoria said. "The title, the equity, those aren't charity. I want to be clear about that. I know. I'm not good at this kind of thing. Managing relationships that are also professional arrangements. I tend to be precise. I was going to say difficult. Those can be the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll try not to be difficult. I'll hold you to that. Don't. Give me some runway." He glanced at the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window. "Emma's appointment is at 9 tomorrow," he said. "I'll be in the office if there's an office by noon. There's an office. You haven't signed anything yet. I'll sign when I get back." "Before or after the appointment?" "After," he said. "I don't sign things before 9 a.m. cardiology appointments. That's a personal rule." Something happened in her expression, not exactly a smile, but the shape underneath a smile, the structural precondition of it. "That's a reasonable rule," she said. The car moved down the mountain. The road wound through aspen groves and past frozen streams and small signs of the life that existed at lower altitude. A gas station, a farmhouse, a stretch of fence line, the ordinary things. "She's going to be fine," Victoria said. It was not a question. "She's going to be fine," Lucas confirmed. Not because he was certain, certainty was beyond anyone's capacity here, but because it was what he believed, and it was what he operated from, and the alternative was not a place he allowed himself to occupy. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Victoria said. "She is. She has opinions about bird migration, and she takes them very seriously." A pause. "I've never had opinions about bird migration. You could develop some." "I could," she said, and her voice carried something that, in a different person, in a warmer register, you might have called hope. On Victoria, it was quieter than that, more private. The mountain fell away behind them. The highway opened ahead flat and clear and leading back toward airports and offices and the complicated, imperfect machinery of the lives both of them were living. Lucas kept both hands on the wheel. He thought about Emma asleep in her room right now, the bird book on her nightstand, her quiet, formidable presence in his life. He thought about Claire, the way he always did at the moments that felt like turning points, not with grief, exactly, but with a kind of acknowledgement, a checking in. Are you seeing this? He thought about the room yesterday, the moment he'd stepped through that door. Not heroic, not dramatic, just necessary, the thing that needed to happen and that he could make happen, and so he had. This was, he thought, the simplest possible description of competence, knowing what you're capable of, and refusing to pretend otherwise when it matters. Victoria Hale, in the back seat, was looking at the road ahead. She was thinking something she would not have known how to say yesterday, and still wasn't entirely sure how to say today. That the thing she had called weakness, the choosing of a child over a career, the organizing of a life around love rather than ambition, was not weakness at all. It was a different architecture, one that produced something she had not, in her particular version of life, yet found a way to produce. She did not know what to do with that thought exactly. She kept it. The snow had stopped. The valley was bright and ordinary and completely itself. The car drove on. Some people are exactly who they appear to be. Most people are not. The distance between those two versions, between the category and the person, is where almost every important mistake gets made. Lucas Reed had known this for a long time. It had taken Victoria Hale 48 hours in a blizzard to learn it. The deal closed 23 days later. Emma's surgery was scheduled for the following March. She came through it with her grandmother's stubbornness and her mother's eyes, and she had, according to her cardiologist, an excellent prognosis. When Lucas told her about it afterward, the whole thing, the snow, the languages, the room, she listened with the full gravity of someone 8 years old who takes these matters seriously. Did she say sorry? Emma asked. She did, Lucas said. Was it a good sorry? He thought about it. Yes, it was accurate. Emma considered this. Accurate is better than big, she said. He agreed that it was.